ancestors were. Not the bad parts. That's the whole idea of Sankofa. You go back and you take what was good, what's worth bringing forward and carrying on and carrying you and your family and your people forward. And the things that were drama, the things that were trauma, you leave behind.
Well, and I would say, Brother Jackson, let me unmute here. I would say, Brother Jackson, that a lot of times, and she deals with it very well in the book, is that a lot of times you don't know where it came from because you got it from your parents, you got it from their parents, and so it was passed down from your great grandparents. But the reality of it is, if it was necessary for cultural adaptations for survival, like you said, the man had to understand that he had no power over his daughter, over his wife. He loved them. But I know at any moment the master could come in my house.
That's right.
And sell my daughter, sell my son, sell my wife. So you can imagine each day when the door opened, what the thought process might be.
Yeah.
And so that begins to affect your thinking. You begin to create these cultural adaptations that your children get from you, and it's passed on. And so with chattel slavery, what she does in the book is that she talks about the reality of the situation that our ancestors were in. We have to applaud them for what they did do to help us survive. But at the same time, what you just said was that not everything that they did as a cultural adaptation was good.
No.
But it was necessary in many cases for the survival.
That's right.
And you do what you need to do to survive, although it creates trauma.
Yes. When my mother was alive, she told me stories, and she grew up in the Delta of Mississippi. And she told me stories of how you could have black folks in a space having fun, laughing, enjoying one another, enjoying life. And a white policeman could just walk in the room and everything stopped. Because you knew that he had all the power to kill you. He had all the power to do what he wanted to do. And you had a lot of them. You had a lot of them that were in love with a black girl that a black man was in love with. And they would kill or torture the black man to get him away from the black woman.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't like it. They claimed not to like black folks. But he liked that black woman enough to keep her on the side. That's one of the strange realities that we have. That's one of the legacies of slavery that we have. And I mentioned this before. I do genealogies. I research my stuff, and I'm able to go back quite a ways now. And I found out some interesting stuff. At certain points on this genealogical search, I run out of great-great-grandfathers, and I just have the mother there. But then when you can read some of the other documents that's associated with it, then you find out who the father was. And there's a reason I have 10% of my heritage that comes from England and Scotland, because that's who the fathers were, who raped my great-great-great-grandmother. And I can go back, and that's the part that frustrates me. Man, I can go back to like the 1400s on that side. If I choose to go down that route, I have a straight shot, no problem at all. But because I'm trying to pick up records that didn't exist really for people of African descent here in the United States, it's hard to go beyond slavery. But what I have found that happened is that I have found one of my ancestors, this is on my mother's side, who was willed to somebody else.
Mm.
And and That document just took me back. This ancestor happened to be wheeled twice. He was wheeled when he was 10 years old, and after his owner died, the owner's wife wheeled him again. But this time, she wheeled him and his wife, which, like I said earlier, was rare. It was rare. Uh, but he got to go with her during that time, and I'm glad that he did because they were a couple, and it's just unbelievable that people found love um, in that kind of hell.
Mhm.
Now, the other thing I want to read comes out of the workbook on page 29, and it's going to speak to, uh, it's going to correspond to what she said in the book, and it's titled "Within the Inch of Your Life: Discipline or Abuse." And it said, in a recent talk in South Carolina, I was speaking to an ethnically diverse audience of professionals and community members. As is common, the African Americans in the audience often responded to my presentation by verbalizing their feelings out loud. This behavior is commonly referred to as call and response. And so during the question and answer period, someone asked if I would share my thoughts on how African Americans discipline their children. So I began by asking African Americans in the audience if they got whippings, and the majority responded with laughter and affirmative comments. I then specifically asked if they were familiar with the practice of children being told to go out, get a switch from a tree, and then bring it back so it could be used on them. And I received an even louder and more animated affirmative response. I've heard comedians talk about that. I've heard people talk about that. But now, next, I began to expand on the account that I was familiar with, where the child was asked to bring back several twigs, at which point the adult, meting out the punishment, would then braid them together. Again, there were affirmative responses. Finally, I finished the story by telling them that the braided twigs were then dipped in water before hitting the child. In place of laughter and affirmation of a few seconds ago, there were murmurs and discomfort. After I completed my story, I asked them what the braided set of twigs soaked in water resembled. Now there was silence. I asked again. Again, I was met with a very uncomfortable audience, silence. So I answered for them, a whip. I said, I next asked them what this particular practice likely originated, and they answered slavery. So now I sensed a clear ambivalence from the African American participants about the account that I had just shared. Their discomfort stemmed from the interpretation and beliefs about how they were disciplined as children, and more to the point about how they perhaps disciplined their children. I knew some of the participants had the standard justification running through their minds, justifications like spare the rod and spoil the child, or it was an act of love, or look at me and I turned out okay. Now I will admit that I have used look at me, I turned out okay too. Maybe I didn't turn out okay.
Mhm.
I don't ever want, I didn't ever want my children, I don't want my grandchildren to be able to confuse discipline with punishment. Discipline has a it has a role, and it has an end. Punishment seems to be indefinite to me. Discipline is not. And discipline cannot be done out of just severe anger, because if I do discipline out of severe anger, then I'm no longer disciplining people, then I'm abusing people. I understand the analogy. It's a very real analogy. And I never want to be one to just because I was injured don't mean I need to injure somebody else. I don't care how it turned out. There are things that perhaps were done to me that should not have been done to me. And I don't want to keep perpetuating that, and more than that, keep perpetuating something that grew out of slavery. Again, I think that's one of those things that we need to be able to break. That's one of those things that we need to be able to get away from, that we can leave in the past. This is what we did, yes, but that's not what we do now. Remember, we're still trying to survive, but we're not trying to survive under those situations that our ancestors were. It's a brand new ball game. It's a brand new ball game, and we need to treat life like that. We need to treat our life experiences like that. We need to treat our reactions like that. Um, and what we do, we need to really recognize why we're doing. Um, a big thing, and we talked about this the other week. Many African Americans discipline their children during that time, and certainly after that time, in a harsh way in front of white people, because they knew that no matter how they disciplined them, they were not going to kill them. And they did that because if they left it to the hands of other folks, their kids might not survive. That's a frustrating thing. That's trauma that you take with you. And I know that many of us have taken some trauma to the next generation, uh, because we believed that that was appropriate at the time. Yes, it got us over a hump, but was it really appropriate? Did it do more damage than good? Perhaps it was good for one time, for one point in time, but it may not be now because circumstances have changed. And I think that we need to be able to change with the circumstances. It's the same way that we don't practice medicine the way we practice medicine in the 1800s. I'm not going to the hospital and for an infection and they saying, well, you got bad blood and putting leeches on me or cutting me. That's what people did. That's what folks did. And so if we changed our thought on medicine, we changed our thought on theology and on sociology, and on mental health, which we now acknowledge is a major issue here. If we changed our thought on all those, we need to be able to examine everything that we used to do, even the stuff that we lived through, because we should be getting better every day. That should be our goal. I want to be better. I want to be a better parent than my parents were. Well, that may not happen, but I'm a grandparent, so I got a chance to be a better grandparent. And I think we all are better grandparents than we are parents. And Dr. McPherson, you hadn't experienced this part yet, but I'm going to tell you, grandparenting is a whole different ball game, man. You catch a case for your grandkids, but you have lived through things, and the standard joke is your kids say, why don't y'all stop them from doing that? Y'all whipped us for doing that. Well, it's because now we're in a different position and we understand what's important and what's not. When we were there acting as your parent, we didn't understand the situation and everything was important. I wasn't gonna let you tear somebody else's house up, so I'm gonna come down on you hard. But now with grandkids, man, folks just cut grandkids loose and cut them slack and give them the ability to run and explore and to grow. And then we can handle things a lot more calmer than we did back in the day because we know in the end it ain't that serious.
You're a different person.
Yeah.
One of the things that I like what you read about it in terms of the study guide in chapter 4,
Yes.
when she's talking about trauma and what's going on. Think about why she tells this story that you read in front of this group of people,
Mm-hmm.
because she knows that as she gets deeper into it, it's going to change from, oh yeah, it happened to me. I used to do it. It worked on me. Spare the rod,
Yeah.
spar the child.
Yeah.
To us, hopefully beginning to deal with the fact that okay, after you learn this, maybe it's not so funny.
Yeah.
But humor is a coping mechanism.
Yes.
Did we need to do capital punishment on our children because it occurred to us? Did it have a place in terms of whether or not they were successful? Or is the truth just a simple fact that did it remind of a whip?
Mhm.
And does that remind people of slavery? And now that I realize that I may or may not, but I may be doing this because of some unresolved trauma, should I be whipping my child with a whip?
Yes.
And if I realize that maybe I shouldn't, then if I can do that with that, then maybe I can have the cognitive change with other things and realize just because we used to do it that way, you said that the goal was growth
Mhm.
and development. So
Mhm.
as I grow and as I develop, and maybe based on the times or the time that I live, maybe something that my parents taught me is not as relevant now to what I need to do with my children.
That's it.
Maybe it's more relevant.
That's it. Well, and my thing is, when are we gonna learn the lessons? That's something that my great grandparents have to do to my great grandparents to keep them alive. My great grandparents have to do that to my grandparents to keep them alive. Perhaps my grandparents have to do it to my parents to keep them alive. But I'm no longer in that situation. I'm no longer sharecropping.
Mm.
I live where I live. I drive what I drive. I work where I work. I live in a completely different world. I shouldn't have to beat the hell out of my kids out of fear that somebody else is going to come and do the job worse than me at this point. At this point. And we should have gone through that, and we should have grown through that.
Mhm. Unless the culture continued it.
Yeah.
Unless the elders said that child is not going to do right unless you do what I taught you how to do.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard decision. And I think that's what Dr. DeGruy is doing in the book, is that she's pointing out that when you start unpacking your trauma and you start realizing that something that I just thought was normal
Yeah.
is not normal, or at in 2021, it's not what's best for my children. And here's the difficult part. And how do I stop? How do I change my thinking?
Yeah.
How am I going to do something different? When in some ways it seems like that might have worked for
Yeah.
some people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So these are very difficult decisions. And so that's just an example of what she does in the book, especially in chapter 4. In this chapter, she does a very good job of talking about what are the effects of trauma.
Yeah.
What happened to me when I saw those planes fly into the World Trade Center?
Yes.
What went through my mind when I saw that?
Yes.
And how has that impacted me months and now years,
20 years later.
20 years later? How has that impacted the state of Oklahoma?
Yeah.
How's that impacted Oklahoma City? What happens when you go down to the memorial down there?
Yes.
See, where's our memorial?
Yeah.
See, if we don't start talking about what Dr. Joy is talking about in Oklahoma City, where's our memorial for what has happened to African people?
Yes.
And so that's what I like. And that's why I'm hoping that we can spend some time really, really looking at this book, because what the book does is that it helps us understand that those bombings didn't affect just Black people.
No.
But slavery, on the other hand, also didn't just affect Black people.
Yes.
To be that inhuman, to say someone's not a person, and then to teach your children that, and then they teach their children that. So by the time you get to the current generation, the children don't even know why they feel the way they
But
feel.
because it was not just physical, it was psychological. And you can't take away somebody's humanity and build up your humanity at the same point. Because now what you're doing, as Dr. King talked about, you have a false sense of superiority, and the people on the other end have a false sense of inferiority. Like I've gone as far as I can go, and I can't get above this.
And
And
so,
then people say things like, "Well, that's not what we do." You know, these folks won't let us do this. Dr. Joy told a story in his book, and I heard her tell this in person at Russ College about how trauma affects people. Because it was real interesting watching my students watch the planes fly into the World Trade Center today. Because it was before they were born. They'd heard about 9/11 their whole life. Some of them had not seen that footage. And they saw it from different angles. And they asked a heck of a lot of questions. So the example that she uses, if somebody comes in this room and shoots somebody, everybody in here is affected with that trauma. If somebody's in the hall and they hear this, then they're affected by the trauma. If it's me and my wife and my children and my grandchildren are affected by this trauma, all in a different kind of way. So with the institution of slavery, who was not affected by that trauma? Certainly if you were here, if you were a free Black person, you were affected by this trauma. It got us all.
and I want to go, because you brought up a point in terms of education. So since if we go to page 28, and you're talking about this inferiority and superiority, she quotes Dr. Carter G. Woodson.
Yes.
She says that the same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything and has accomplished everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of genius in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other people. The Negro thus educated in a hopeless liability of the race. The difficulty is that the educated Negro, that would be us, is compelled to live and move among his own people whom he has been taught to despise. He has been taught to despise by the education system. He has been taught to decide. And, you know, I was told that the higher you go in the education system, I have a PhD, the crazier you get. The more educated away from your people you get, because that's a different system. And so sometimes it confuses. But she goes on to say this: the difficulty is that the educated Negro is compelled to live and move among his own people, whom he has been taught to despise. As a rule, therefore, the educated Negro prefers to buy his food from a white grocer because he has been taught that the Negro is not clean. It does not matter how often a Negro washes his hands, that he cannot clean them. And no matter how often a white man uses his hands, he cannot soil them. And so that's a process of education that if the system, and you talk about chattel slavery, but after that, and up until today, and still now, it's still teaching this system that allows one group, for, as you said with Dr. King, a false belief in superiority. At the same time, it gives another group a false belief about inferiority.
Yes, yes.
And so how do you address that? That's why I love this book. When I saw your church reading it, is that if you really look at what Dr. Dew is saying, she's saying America's legacy of enduring injury and healing. And what she's saying now is let the healing begin.
Yeah.
As we read this book, as your church reads this book, the point is that can we use this knowledge? Can we use this information to heal, to get better, to make our children's situation better, to make our community situation better? And so this book to me is a guide. It's not the only guide.
Yeah.
But she's one of our scholars who spent the time. She's did the scholarship. She's done the research. If you look at the book, when she starts to talk about how to deal with this trauma.
Yes.
Well, you can't deal with a trauma if you, first of all, won't be honest.
That's right.
So one of the things she says is that one of the first steps is you have to tell the truth. Yeah. But nobody want to talk about the truth. Here you go. Truthfulness, the first criterion for change. This is on page 13 in the book. Truthfulness means you can't keep lying. Truthfulness, the first criterion for change. Truthfulness has two components. One is honesty, and the other is accuracy. The degree to which one both honestly and accurately answers the questions that follow is a degree to which change. See, you want to know why there's no change? You want to know why it's not happening? Because we don't want to talk, we don't want to deal with the reality of the situation. And as long as America doesn't choose to deal with the reality of the situation, then it will continue. And so she does a good, let me just say a little bit more. She says this here: telling the truth is the first step in this analysis. So if we want to tell the truth, we might as well stop. Either these things happened in history that Dr. DeGruy was talking about, or they didn't. Or let's leave Dr. DeGruy out of this. Either there was a massacre in Tulsa 100 years ago, the worst in U.S. history, or there wasn't. But there's no debate anymore. So if that many people were killed, and the people that killed them and the people that were killed had to do what the brother that you described, telling his narrative from slavery, they had to deal with it and keep on moving.
Yeah, they had to.
See, that's what causes the trauma. No matter how, man, can you imagine how much, and this is just me, I know. Man, I love my daughters. My daughters, I can only imagine my feeling of how bad I would want to get to that man.
Yes.
Because of what you're doing to my family. And the sense of hopelessness. It's natural for me as a man to want to protect my family.
That's right.
That's my role. One of my roles is to protect my family. But if you take that role away from me, historically, how does it affect my children and their children and their children? Pastor Coleman and I are going to be doing a different series on historical trauma in the Black male and the African-American male. And so we'll talk more about this idea of powerlessness, of where your power, your ability to protect your own has been taken away. You know, it talks about after the end of slavery, how African people had to go back, men and women, and try to find their wives, try to find their children, try to reconnect with the people that they love. And you want to hear a cultural adaptation that has its roots in Africa? From what I understood and what I was reading just today, that sometimes because it had been 10 or 12 years, when you found your wife, when you found your husband, they were remarried.
Yeah.
And guess what they did?
Yeah.
What they did was they figured out ways to integrate the other person into the new family so everybody could be a family.
Oh, wow.
Well, what was I going to do? Get away from me?
Yeah.
I don't love you no more?
Yeah. Yeah.
See, that's a different cultural concept. If you think about it, that's a different cultural concept.
It is.
And so having to constantly psychologically adapt to traumatic situations, Dr. Drew talks about how just viewing something one time can be traumatic.
Yes.
Can you imagine a system? And if you don't believe me, you got to read the book. You got to look at the history, and you have to acknowledge the truth. Either Senate Bill number 1 in Oklahoma was a Jim Crow law and it's not.
Yes.
Now here's the thing: if Senate Bill number 1 was a Jim Crow law, what kind of psychological damage did that do to the people of Oklahoma?
Yeah.
You notice I didn't say black people.
Yeah.
See, if you look at segregation, what did that do to those white children when they were told that they couldn't go to school with black children because black children were inferior? What did that do to their mind?
There were a lot of rude awakenings in the 60s and 70s. A lot of rude awakenings. And I think they're going to have to be a lot of rude awakenings now because, as you said, truth has become politicized. And so that's why we have all these bills that we have, like 1775 or whatever, because if we have to start with truth, they don't want us to tell the truth. And so we can't teach the truth. We get people that just gloss it over. And as we said the other week, then our African ancestors came here as immigrants and not kidnapped as slaves. And our African ancestors were happy here. The myth of the happy slave. They were happy here. They were satisfied here. They really didn't want to be free and all that stuff. And so I'm at the point, particularly with black men now. How dare you criticize black men at this point when you had slave farms and you sent men out to other plantations just like you sent your horse or your bull to other plantations.
And so, what does that do to someone psychologically who knows what they're doing is wrong? Think about that. A lot of times we say that no, they just no. A lot of people knew. How could you not know if you wanted to know? But what Dr. DeGruy talks about, and I don't want us to miss this, is that she talks about the dehumanization. See, if you're not a person, then you have no rights.
Yeah,
so I had to
that's right.
dehumanize you so that way psychologically I can sleep at night. You know, but you talk about one, man, when I went to Goree Island in Senegal, or when I went to Elmina Dungeon,
Yes.
or when I went to Cape Coast Dungeon, and I saw that in each of those dungeons, they had cannons around the outside.
Yes, they do.
And they had a church on the inside.
That's right.
You go to Senegal to Goree Island, you have to ask your question. They said, how could these people be on the second floor praying? Go to Goree Island in Senegal where the door of no return is. But on the first floor, you had these Africans who had been captured, taken away from their people, who are weeping and wailing, and you over here saying you having church. And then the one in Ghana, the governor, remember these were not people, but the governor built a private stairway, remember, down from his room down to where they kept the African women so he can rape them at will.
Yes.
Now, how do you justify that in your mind? And then you're the pastor, so how do you justify that if you say that you're truly a believer?
Because so many folks are not.
Hmm.
They have taken this thing and turned it into something else. And I tell you when that began to happen, it began to happen when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire. And it then stopped being a native Palestinian earthly religion, and it became the religion of empire. They even organized it like empire. The Catholic Church is organized like Roman politics used to be organized. This is why you got a bishop and an archbishop and a cardinal and all that. You have different levels of government. And so now you have different levels of governance in here. And then Constantine brought the bishops there and decided, look, in the 300s, mind you, we need to decide what it is that we actually believe. Because you had these bishops in North Africa that were saying that Jesus is this. And these bishops elsewhere said, no, Jesus is this. And it became a major thing. And they went with everybody else and sidelined the African bishops. And everything that the African bishops wrote, they then started collecting it and burning it.
What's the council?
The Council of Nicaea.
NICE.
First one. and you know, Chalcedon and just so many. It was over a long period of time, the Roman Catholic Church evolved out of the Jesus movement and the Palestinian earthly religion that Jesus started. The one that was built on love, the one that was built on power, the bit that was built on mercy, and dependent upon God. And then they went to this thing here, but God is the soldier. God is the soldier. God is rich. God is so powerful that he disregards people.
Well, and because culturally, they developed that religious process in the way that they thought would continue their situation.
And Jesus started to look just like them too.
Well, it was necessary, wasn't it? Because you can't dehumanize someone who looks like the deity. You can't dehumanize someone who had hair like brown, like what? Hair like wool, brown wool, like wool. And so what I'm saying is that it creates a psychological divide or cognitive dissonance when on the one hand, this is the truth, but on the one hand, you practice this for other motives.
Yeah.
And then over time, you begin to get it confused.
So they bastardized Christianity is what they did. But see, you can never tell me anything. This is why there's no substitute for international travel.
Okay.
So when I went to Palestine, and we're in Bethlehem. Yeah, that Bethlehem. but
Okay.
Jesus was born in the Church of the Nativity, and the chapel, the sanctuary is up like on the floor that you walk in on, but down beneath on the second floor is the spot that tradition says Jesus was born. So when you reach those steps to go down, there's a picture of the Madonna and child right there, and they don't look European, y'all.
And this is where?
They look very dark skinned.
And where was this at?
In Bethlehem at the Church of the Nativity, where they say Jesus was born. When you walk down those very steps, and you can put your hand on the rock that they said this is the spot that Jesus was born.
And so another archaeological, anthropological, historical proof. But why is that not the normal story, Mr. Jackson? Why is what you're telling me supposed to be surprising?
Because our folk ain't been to Texas, let alone Palestine.
And so one of the ways that we deal with this historical trauma, one of the ways we deal with this injury is you as a pastor are able to say to people, I'm not telling y'all what I read.
Yeah.
I'm not telling you what I heard. I went to Africa, because that's what it is. I went to Palestine.
And I took pictures.
And you took pictures.
So
what if you begin to teach the children a different historical narrative? What if we're at a school or a church or a mosque or a place to where systematically we were addressing the historical injustices? Why was the first bill in Oklahoma a segregation bill? Because if you understand that, then you begin to understand why you have to do certain things if you want to be successful, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And so now, if I'm going to try to be successful in this system that in many ways history has shown that's biased against me, then I'm going to have some trauma, because how do you graduate from a University of Oklahoma? How do you graduate from those institutions without dealing with that trauma?
Yeah. Yeah. And look, and how do you go into church and stay 30 years and not learn anything about that? I mean, there's trauma that has been embedded in our religious practices that we have yet to acknowledge, because we take everything as sacred and it came from God. Some of that didn't come from God, it came from racists.
Let me give you an example if I could. 8 years old, I am introduced to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I'm 8 now. And the elders begin to tell me the story of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. You know what my naive self said? Well, why do the white people not want to pray with them? I'm 8. I'm not understanding why the white people said y'all can't pray with us. And so the elders had to go form a whole nother church to where they could even, hear what I said? They wouldn't even let them pray. Now, remember now, that was good for me. It hurt, but it was good for me to learn that at 8 years old, my ancestors had to create an entire religious institution, if you will, the AME church, colleges and everything. They had to create that, get this, out of necessity, because they couldn't even be treated human in the church.
That's right.
Now, how powerful is that? If you don't want to treat me right, you want to be equal with me, we'll go build our own. I'm going to say it again real slow. You don't like me? You don't want to treat me right? You don't want to treat me fairly? Then we'll go create our own African Methodist Episcopal Church. So that gave me a sense of pride.
Yeah, it should have.
At a young age, I'm like, okay, so that's what you do. That's what they taught me.
Yeah.
At a young age, if somebody doesn't treat you right, if somebody is abusing you, then you need to try to go create your own to where you can have some dignity.
That's right.
And respect for yourself. And if you look at what she's talking about in the book in terms of about what happens in terms of the manifestations of trauma, it comes because you have been dehumanized, and many times you begin to believe it.
Yeah.
Your children believe it. You know, I've had young men tell me, I say, man, I'm gonna help you get a job. They say, well, let's go see if we can find any maintenance job. Now, I don't have no problem with maintenance. Why are you asking for that specifically? You know why they're asking for that? Because they think that that's all they can do.
Yeah.
And so that right there still comes out of this historic. And so I got to really, really push the book, because again, man, talks about she talks about in terms of lynchings. And if you look at the book, what's the one, Sanctuary? There's another one called 100 Lynchings. The other one's called Without Sanctuary.
Yeah.
A lot of those are in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So think about this. When you look at those lynching postcards and you see the families and you see the little children, what does that do to the psychology of a 6-year-old child that can see a burning human being, a burning black man who has been decapitated or whatever they've done to them,
Genitals cut off.
genitals cut off, they taking people's ears. I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
And the child thinks it's okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Joy has a one on the internet where she asked the question, and this is Oklahoma, so this is really gonna hit on. She's on stage and she says, "What if I brought a puppy up here and just stomped it in the head and stomped it out?" What would people do? People would trip out. You just killed a puppy.
Yeah.
See, but a black man gets shot. Something happens to one of ours, and how all of a sudden you don't feel that same passion because you didn't see that black man as even as important as you saw that pet.
That's right.
You have dehumanized us, the black man, to make it seem like when things occur, that's why you needed to be in prison. That's why we put you in prison, because you're doing these things. But no one wants to talk about the history of what happened to create the current environment that we're in now.
Because it's ongoing. And the media, the social media now creates this clickbait. And so we get a chance to see African Americans executed over and over and over and over again. Our kids have grown up with that kind of stuff. I mean, we could start it at Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown and just move forward. Now, you and I know we can go back a long way, longer than that, but just start right there for kids that are in their mid-20s now. When this stuff happened, I mean, it happened all through high school, all through college, all through young adulthood. They got a chance to see black people executed on TV, on the news all the time. And that's trauma. That's trauma.
Especially when your parents told you it wasn't like that anymore. That's why it's so traumatic to the young people, because the elders said they had a civil rights movement, they fought and they fixed all this. And I do believe they thought that. But let me say that again. You were told that Martin Luther King had a dream. It was a civil rights movement. And then the hit to just become the finale, you got a black president. So how can you say America's racist? You got a black president. That's what they said. Because we had President Obama, then America couldn't be racist. And so that's when I said, that's why we need to read. That's why we need to study. One man can't change the historical system.
I think that President Obama is a very good man, and I, like so many folks, enjoyed 8 years of pride while he was there.
And how much did you see change locally?
Nothing.
Oh, now look at a little bit. Now, come on.
But the reality is, our right to vote was still not solidified.
And now, what you see, and you're the politician, I'm not. But the historical trauma says now there must be an active fight to fight that, because if you don't, it could happen again.
Now, and I can tell you how I know it'll happen again. How in the world did this nation fight a war from 1861 to 1865? And they forgave so fast that they had Confederate monuments in D.C.
Because for them, that wasn't a historical issue. That was their heroes. It wasn't ours. See, you have to remember, you had a North and a South. But the South was just how far down? It was just Virginia. It's not like it was Virginia, Maryland.
Well, I mean, but look, you can find Confederate monuments in Missouri, which was a slaveholding state. And somebody like me that grew up in the South, if you go to any small town, every town square has a Confederate statue.
Remember Holly Springs, Mississippi, when we went down the Russ?
Yeah.
Had a whole square.
Yeah. I mean, and everything, the little town I went to high school in,
And
right
so,
outside Jackson.
wow. And so the question becomes, I see the flag, I go to the small town, and so I equate that symbol with a certain mentality.
That's right.
I'm gonna say it again. I equate that symbol with a certain mentality. Now I don't know if I'm 100% sure not everybody in my little hometown is racist.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are some there for sure, but not everybody. But even if you're not a racist, if the town has a racist culture, most people aren't going to step outside of their safety and security. They talk about allies. Nah, they ain't going to step outside their safety and security and ally you to be hurt by their own group.
But in order to even begin to approach that, truth must be told.
And so you just said this. You said that they changing the truth. Dr. DeGruy, and this is what I encourage in this book, but in one of the things that I did when I taught at OU, OCU, everywhere is one of my slogans that was taught to me by one of my elders, Dr. Mark, was there's no substitute for scholarship. No. See, we can debate truths, but I think that I think everybody agreed that there was a huge massacre in Tulsa. I don't think there's any debate on that anymore. No. People say, Doc, Kevin, Doc, I didn't know, Doc. People told I didn't know. And guess what? I didn't know until I got to college and I took Oklahoma history in high school. Yeah. How do you take Oklahoma history and not learn about that? Then they tell me there was a trail of tears and they got mad because I asked the question, well, why were they crying? If it was a trail of tears, why were they crying? Then they had to go deeper. Yeah. And what Dr. Joy talks about is that was never the intent to go deeper. And so there's been no healing. Again, being slapped in the face at 8 years old, being told that the black people were not allowed to pray with the white people in the Methodist Church in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And so Absalom Jones and Richard Allen had that, man, that made me, I'm Absalom Jones. I'm Richard Allen. And that's a scary thing when you begin to teach people at a young age to believe in themselves and to believe in their culture and to believe in their family. Because then they'll start to believe they can do anything. Uh-oh. Yeah. Watch out now. You see.
Now, Doc, but we're getting close to the end, but I got a very personal story I want to tell, but I want to ask you first. Mm-hmm. How old were you when you discovered racism? Or when racism discovered you?
I think my mother was that parent that you was talking about. Yeah. She was worried. She had 5 boys older than me. And I have a brother 15 years older than me. So when I'm 5, he's 20. So she's seen this gamut of what can happen to young. So she was very protective of me. Yeah. So guess what she told me as I was watching my older brothers grow up? She began to teach me about it. In Wichita, Kansas, my brothers and sisters integrated to schools and there was riots in Truesdale Middle School. So when my brothers and sisters came home in Wichita from the riots, talking about how they had fought, somebody had explained to me, what's a riot? And why y'all fighting? And why is it black against white? And why don't they want y'all to go to the school with them? What's wrong? Get this. What's wrong with y'all? What's wrong with us? Yeah. Why do we have to fight to integrate? So, man, as long as I can remember, my family's been telling me that, listen, there's a white world and there's a black world, and you live in a white world. So you better learn how to figure out how to deal with them so you can survive and build your own. So I'll leave it with this. And so that leads me to have Frantz Fanon dealing with black skin, white mask.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I'm at OU. I'm trying to graduate. I'm trying to get a doctorate, but there are so many cultural barriers. Yeah. But guess what I had to do if I wanted to get a PhD? I had to deal with that. I had to do whatever they said, whatever needed to be done. And I didn't want to do it. Had some sleepless nights. Had some issues with racist professors. But because of where I came from, Brother Jackson, and because of I was expecting this, guess what they told me? You can't quit. Don't let them make you not successful. So that was my mentality. There's nothing you can do to me to stop me from being successful because I've been fighting you all my life. Yeah. So I think that's part of the difference in terms of growing up like I did and basically in a white town versus when I come to urban areas that's primarily black. They don't have that history and that experience interacting where I did from the time I was young. And so I say that to say is that our children will do better if we teach them the truth.
They will.
I did better. because I had some hard truths about race in my hometown at a very young age.
Well, I had it slap me in the face. My neighborhood in Jackson, Mississippi, was 100% black. I lived in an enclave. I felt absolutely protected. I mean,
Mhm.
I didn't know what fear was. I mean, it just happened like that. And I was a latchkey kid to the elementary school in the neighborhood. Now, both my parents were teachers, and my father
Mhm.
was an actual administrator in another county, in Rankin County. And Rankin County is widely known as the most racist county in the state of Mississippi.
Mm.
Daddy was the only black administrator.
Mm.
So my father was going to move me and my brother Peter to Pearl, where he worked. So they were just getting ready to close West Side and send them to the white school, send all the black kids to the white school. And my father and my parents decided to send us to Pearl with Daddy. So that Christmas, that first semester was my last time at West Side. So we drive over to Pearl every day. And my first day in the fourth grade,
Mm.
I'm just trying to figure out where I need to go. And I'll see these white girls put their backs on the wall like this. Like I have something that I could pass to them. I could, like my black skin would rub off on them. And I'm like, what is this about? Because I hadn't had any problem with any white kids. Because I didn't know really. But I'm just stuck. And I'm like, what is this? Why they treat me like that? And I would have a lot more rude awakenings when I was over at Pearl. And it just kind of woke me up to the difference in what kind of world it was. And I went and graduated high school in that kind of world. But then I went to Jackson State and HBCU. And HBCUs are normally either urban or rural. Jackson State's an urban HBCU.
Mhm.
Uh, had about 10,000 students there. And Jackson State really roughly about 95% African American. Again, I'm back in an enclave. I ain't worried about nothing. I feel completely safe. But I transferred and went to Murray State University in Western Kentucky. And it was a complete reversal of everything that I experienced at Jackson State. Murray State was about 90% white. It was rural, uh, just a whole different atmosphere. I cried 30 days. I cried
Mm.
every night for 30 days. I did not want to be in this place. But I graduated because I hated it so much. I wanted to go and get out of there. And so I graduated. But I found myself in this situation where I had to learn and deal with some other people. Some folk I
Mm.
didn't want to deal with. But I got there. Murray State had a library, one of the best libraries I've ever been in. They had a whole section of black books
Mhm.
that nobody ever checked out. I did so much reading doing that.
And
And
section E 185
man,
at OU.
it was unbelievable. I'm like, nobody checked this out. And I always had some of those books. And so a lot of the black students would come and say, hey, I'm doing this report on whatever. You got a book on so and so and so and so. And I would tell them where to go, but I had also started collecting books. So I go to Nashville. I see a book that I heard about. I buy it. Not that I necessarily read it right there, but I said, hey, this is a book that I need to have. And the reality is that one of the things that attracted me to my wife is that we had most of the same books. So at home right now, we got doublets on the shelves. She got stuff with her initials in it. I got stuff with my initials in it because we were reading the same things. And I'm like, oh shoot, I found the kindred spirit now.
There you go.
It's on.
Mhm.
It's on. So, Doc, I'm gonna give you the last word on this thing this evening, man. And I'm just glad we at this point.
Well, and I just want to push, the nerd in me, the teacher in me wants to push that there are reflection questions and there are discussion questions there are reflection questions, there are discussion questions in each chapter in the book.
Yes.
One of the things I want to ask people is, if you just think about this, is that, what were you first taught about racism?
Hmm.
You asked me that question, and I kind of answered in terms of that, what did your family teach you about racism? What did you learn in school about racism? And so as you begin to answer these questions, what you will begin to see is that most of us don't know much about racism, historical trauma, discrimination, the history of what happened in the United States. And if you don't know these things, again, education and learning is your first step.
That's right.
And so she does a great job in the book, and we've kind of gone back and forth, but I want to make sure that I push this whole thing of truthfulness being the first criteria. If you don't want to deal with truth, just go on out around here. I ain't even dealing with you, because you don't want to deal with the truth.
That's
and
right.
If you can't deal with the truth, you cannot heal. If you don't acknowledge your pain and your suffering and your injury, and so we are doing this focusing on African Americans, but this is, as Dr. DeGruy does it, this is for America. This is for
universal.
Oklahoma. Can you imagine how powerful we become as a nation if we can actually deal with some of our, but what we do is that we seem to be doing the exact opposite, and we're becoming more and more injured over the years.
Yeah.
Things are getting worse, and people are getting really, really, really tired. And so I'm looking forward to, next week is the last week. So I'm looking forward to kind of transitioning more into some healing. What are the things that can be done to address this historical trauma? What can you do? What can I do? What can we do to address this historical trauma? And so I'm going to leave you with this. You cannot do anything if you will not put out the effort to read the book.
Amen.
And to get the information.
Amen.
We always want to get the information, but we don't want to put in the work. So I'm saying this again. Both African-American bookstores at 36 and Kelly, Sister Camille at Nappy Roots and Brother Larry at Black Star, they both will have copies of the book. We also have copies of the workbook in. This is something that, don't worry, you say, well, y'all only going to do one more week. Well, no, we're only going to do this one more time. We're going to be pushing this book and the workbook for the upcoming months, because this is foundational knowledge for us to change our situation. If we want things to get better for our children, for our community, we have to deal with our historical trauma.
Amen. Amen. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. We thank you for listening this evening. We thank you for participating. And again, as Dr. McPherson said, we're encouraging you to get the book and read the book and begin to kind of question why I do what I do. Excuse me. And what I have brought from the past and what I'm bringing forward, what I'm handing on to my descendants. God bless you. God keep you.